Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining me for this week's edition of the SMIE Consulting Midweek Roundup. I'm your host, Marty Bennett, and today on the Roundup, we're going to be answering 3 questions we've been hearing from international educators over the past few days. We'll get to those questions in just a minute, but a special shout out to those of you who have been watching live over the past few months. We've passed our now 200th episode of the Midweek Roundup, and very excited about that, and interesting to see where the next 200 will be taking us. As you know, each week we take the questions that we ask here on the Roundup from our newsletter stories. Our newsletter comes out Mondays at 9 a.m. Eastern, roughly. Either you can subscribe to it directly through our website. That's smieconsulting.org/subscribe, and there's a form down the middle of the page where you can subscribe, fill in your name, email, institution, and you'll get that automatically in your inbox. That newsletter has between 3 to 5 to 6 social media stories and 15 to 20 international education stories from not only the United States but around the world that can help shape our views on what's happening in the wider world and what we can be doing to potentially change or enhance what we're doing institutionally to better reach international students. If you don't want to subscribe through our website and you're active on LinkedIn, we have a LinkedIn version of the same newsletter that comes out Monday mornings as well. And I'm dropping the links to each of those newsletter from the website, the current week's edition, and our LinkedIn version of the newsletter into the chat on our Facebook page and YouTube channels, and we'll add that in later on our Twitter and LinkedIn feeds. So do take advantage of those newsletters. It's free subscription. We've got over 850 subscribers nowadays to the newsletter, so we're looking forward to better connecting more international education colleagues. So please share it with your friends. But the Midweek Roundup is always geared on shaping providing our thoughts on some key issues of the day that relate to international study, international education. And the first question is, are you using student peers and personalization in your recruitment? For those that have been following the Midweek Roundup for the last couple, 3-4 years, actually the last 2.5 years, we have developed what we call our 6 P's of strategic international enrollment management. These are our principles that we consider foundational to successful planning for international student recruitment, but not only just recruitment, but enrollment and managing their experience throughout their time at your campuses. So when you use these 6 P's, these principles, it develops a philosophy that really shows that you're purposefully picking people as the priorities in your approach to international student recruitment and international education as a whole. And 2 of those P's, the last 2 P's, are probably the most important: peers and personalization. And that's why I bring this up as it relates to this question. For those that caught last week's live, we were in Belgrade for the EdUSA Regional Forum for Europe, Eurasia, and had the opportunity to present on a panel with Education USA advisors from Azerbaijan, from Poland, and from Georgia. And they each shared their experiences during the pandemic and coming out of it as to how they were able to reach students effectively. And the answers were different depending on the country. Different channels were more effective in one country as opposed to the next. Different ways of engaging with audiences seem to work better in one country over the next. And what this knowledge really reflected was their way to engage their former advisees who are currently in the United States with their current advisees that are preparing to go and apply in this current year to go to the U.S. So that personalization piece, that engaging, having content that is driven by not the institution but by the prospective students' peers, organization at least, that are some of the most impactful kinds of communication prospective students can receive from institutions, where it's not the institutions saying why you're so good, it's your current students that are not, even if they are maybe on staff or paid student workers, they're still students living that experience and able to share what they're going through. And for these EdUSA advisors, that was very much a part of how they convinced their current advisees that, hey, studying in the U.S. can be all you want it to be. And here's some examples of why that's worked, how it's worked successfully. So what I'll be sharing with you in the chat are links to a presentation I did called Going Beyond Webinars, Advanced Strategies for Collaboration Between Eurasian Advisors and U.S. Higher Education Institutions. Also sharing an interesting, well, not interesting, but it's useful guide to working with student ambassadors, and you talk about peers. This particular piece is from the Ambassador Platform, and they're one of the two major student ambassador platforms out there. We know Unibuddy Ambassador Platform is kind of the other major competitor out there that provides that kind of platform where your current students can communicate directly with your prospective student audiences, and provides the mechanisms and the mechanics to make that happen. But this article shares not necessarily just for working with TAP, but it shows if you're starting a student ambassador program, here are some of the things you need to be taking into consideration. Everybody knows that, hey, in an ideal world, we have our current students tell our story for us because they're our best advocates. I learned that within the first few weeks of me starting in domestic admissions back in 1993. Internationally, it's even more important because for your prospective international students, unless they're already in the United States, at an American high school or English language program or community college, they're likely not visiting your campus until they arrive for orientation. So how do you paint that picture of your campus? Yes, you have your virtual tours. Yes, you have your opportunities for live chats. But if you're not involving your current students in that process, it's a complete missed opportunity. So everybody knows it's important. So it's just a matter of how you put the mechanisms together to make that happen on your individual campus. So TAP has a really solid article on nurturing your ambassadors' voices and insights, how to get started with icebreakers, kind of very basic stuff about how to start this group together, about what you're going to cover and all of that. So it's a nice simple article, but if you're in the process of getting going with a student ambassador program, that's probably a great place to start. The other part of this question that some of you may be wondering, what is he talking about there, Marty? He's going off the deep end a bit. What are we talking about personalization? Well, personalization covers a lot of different potential areas in how you communicate specifically with your international students. And here I'm not talking about, well, you're going to call them by their first name in an email that you might send to them, or talk about their major or what country they're from. Those are all good things that you can and should be doing anyway, to help at least show the impression that you're personalizing your communication to them. What I'm talking about here in terms of personalization, there are a number of different layers to this, as I said. Personalization can involve multilingual content that you have available so that you can send messages to students in certain target markets in their native language, or particularly any content that might be directed at parents you might want to have available in that native language. Some of your initial recruitment materials about discussing the admissions process. I'll give you an example. At UNLV, we are HSI, a Hispanic Serving Institution, and our proximity in the southwest of the United States is there are huge Hispanic populations and Latin populations in our area. So there's some natural affinities for us to be more proactive in terms of how we communicate with those audiences. And we're extending that to not only the domestic students from the Spanish-speaking regions that can benefit from language content in Spanish on our website. We've created an entire site that covers Hispanic immigrants to our area, to Desert Southwest of the United States that are interested in higher education for their children, targeting parents, but also children that might not be native speakers yet. We were targeting that at DACA students and also international students from Latin America and Spanish-speaking countries there that would benefit from having content in English or in Spanish that they could have available to help explain the process. And I've worked with that team at UNLV to help develop that content, and part of that has been they had this Para Guia Familia, is what they called it, that page for that had Spanish language content on a variety of different issues. Some of them about the admissions process, some about financial aid. Obviously, financial aid for an international student is a very different beast than it would be for an immigrant family that has permanent residency, perhaps, or asylee or refugee status, and then it would be for a DACA student or an international student. So that's something that as we developed and fleshed out some of the content there, we've created language in there that's appropriate for not only immigrant populations, but DACA students and also international audiences that can distinguish the differences between those groups, because there are significant differences that impact how they apply, what aid they could get, all of those things. So we now have a process beyond this para guia familia. We also have a couple of secondary pages that we've had translated as well, one of which is for our international undergraduate populations that we can use to target students in Spanish-speaking countries in Latin America, to provide parents, and we're doing this primarily for the undergrad audiences, we're not doing it for the graduate, but for undergraduate audiences where parents are absolutely essential in family decisions of where their children will study. We have that content now available where the basics of the admissions process, costs and all those things will be explained in their native language. So that's one example of personalization. Another is the use of what we call personas. Personas are basically internal mechanisms you're setting up, or internal personas you're setting up that describe your ideal student on your campus. And there may be 4 or 5 different varieties of student personas that you would, if you had to describe the kinds of students you want and have on your college campus, these would be their major descriptors, their common identifying traits, and in terms of where they're from, what their goals are, what their kind of spirit is in terms of are they adventurous, are they kind of conservative, are they eager for a challenge, and are they strivers, are they the high flyers academically, and it's okay to have multiple personas on your campus, not multiple personalities necessarily, but multiple personas represented in terms of who makes up your ideal student audiences or ideal student groups on your campus. They'll share some common characteristics. And for international audiences, this is important. Rahul Chadha, about 5 or 6 years ago, had his 4 levels of 4 personas of typical international student personas. He had the high flyers, the strivers, and a couple other variants on that talked on a couple different levels on educational attainment in terms of their abilities, and also financial ability. So there was a kind of a matrix he set that the average student and the high income student, what that persona might look like, and there'd be common characteristics there, what the high achieving academic student and high income academic student would be, then the low income academic student, low income student who is also a high achiever, and what that looked like, and then the low achieving, low financial resource student, what they look like, what their common characteristics are. And some institutions may want would only be able to really ideally want 2 of those 4. Some might want all of those, or be able to accommodate all of those. So it all depends on if you're using those 4 as an example. There are multiple personas that you could have, but again, these are internal things that you use to kind of describe who your target audiences can and should be for who you want to recruit on your campus. And that impacts how you market your institution, how you talk about the admissions process, how you talk about scholarships or financial aid. That if you're an institution that does not have a lot of financial resources, then do you want to be promoting yourself as an accessible institution to low income but high achieving students when you don't have full aid? Probably not. Is that a good use of your time and resources as an institution? Probably not internationally. So it's just a way to help guide your marketing efforts and in terms of attracting the kinds of students that you want, so that certain messages will resonate with certain personas out in the market in terms of how students kind of approach U.S. higher education in terms of what institutions they select to apply to, what parts of the country that they're looking at. So all of these are factors that you can include elements of into how you develop personas. And again, they're not meant to be externally focused and are available. You may do that kind of not covertly, but you may do that in a way where if you have student profiles of your current international students on your site that maybe they're part of your student ambassador program, you might have profiles of those students that might represent some of those key student personas that you're looking for, and ideally that's a way to at least put a public face on what personas you're looking at or want to attract to your institution. But there are ways to do that even within certain regions where there may be a very different kind of student that comes from that region to your institution as opposed to from other regions of the world. So you put a face on the kind of students that you want to come to your institution, and you do that through perhaps the student ambassadors you have working for you, or the profiles you put on your website. But internally, it impacts how you market to that group. What are the core messages that will resonate with a student who's a high flyer academically, but doesn't have great resources available, financial resources to their family? That's potentially a different message than what you send to the high financial resourced family, and that is a middle of the road achiever, or maybe the underachiever academically. So those are things that you want to find in your mix of how you speak to different audiences. And how to get that granular is oftentimes a concern. Do we have the bandwidth to do this? What can we really do A and B messaging to the same group to test to see which one works? And eventually you get to that point where the more sophisticated you are with your marketing. But certainly that's something to shoot for, and the personas and personalization certainly can and should be a part of that. And it was a great session on personas at the EdUSA Forum, and they had a great Google Doc of resources that they've made available to share with interested institutional representatives. So you'll get that today in the chat. So that's a great question to start, and it's one that's always near and dear to my heart in terms of sharing the kind of real meat and potatoes of how international student recruitment and marketing should be done, and the key elements of that peers and personalization needs to be essential to successful recruitment strategies internationally. So let's move on to question 2, and that is, what do recent international education mergers and acquisitions, frankly, acquisitions seem to be the flavor of the month or the flavor of the week last week. What does that mean for international student recruitment? One of these it will be seen as more of a domestic one, and that is EAB, the massive conglomerate higher ed admissions and enrollment consulting firm. Many institutions have been working with EAB for years on this front. Certainly two of the institutions I'm working with now have used EAB or are currently using EAB. They have purchased Concourse. And Concourse, for those not familiar, is kind of a flipped admissions system. Instead of being a name-buy list where institutions can purchase students who fall in a certain criteria, and then they can start communicating with them and encouraging them to inquire about and apply to their institutions. Concourse has a very different system. It's called the flipped admission system, and we've seen a number of institutions kind of explore this possibility in the United States in terms of recruiting non-traditional students, but there's a particular niche internationally where this is becoming increasingly popular. It's an approach that I'm eager to see more institutions take advantage of, because when you look at it, this could be a potentially could be a game changer for U.S. institutions that are trying to up their game internationally to make the process a much more productive use of institutional dollars in terms of how they recruit, and much more transparent. And in fact, what the flipped admissions process does is students have a profile online that they then that they make available that's well, it is in many ways anonymous, but the academic pieces are all the same, country, grades, all of that. And it allows universities to kind of accept them based on those profiles that they're putting out there, and the content and obviously transcripts and all that's vetted by concourse. Now, EAB buying that is potentially a game changer in terms of how not only domestic admissions is done, but internationally how we could be doing admissions for those institutions that are working with EAB that may now also want to take advantage of what concourse has to offer. Because this all goes back to what I talked about earlier with the 6 Ps, and one of those first P is actually perspective, is understanding how when you're recruiting internationally, your place, the US's place, in a globally competitive market for the same students, where you now have students that might be in Nigeria that could be applying to the UK, to the US, to Canada, Australia, and China, where there are significant numbers from Nigeria going to each of those countries. And that reality is, okay, how do we separate ourselves when UCAS is the one form that not only international undergraduate prospects but also international graduate prospects have to fill out for both applying to British universities at the undergraduate level or graduate level. So that is a very simple process. Canada's is a simpler process. Australia is a simpler process than many U.S. institutions. And I'm not talking here about the Ivies. They're going to do their own thing. They're always going to get their numbers, so we don't need to worry about them. They admit less than 10% of their students, and that's in a good year. So what I'm talking about here are the greater majority of U.S. institutions that have, the reality is, are not open access, but are fairly close and have admission standards that are very transparent, that you need a 2.5 or 3.0 and you're admitted to my institution. Here's what you got to prove English proficiency. Here's what you got to prove financially to get an I-20 to come. So what potentially this does is it says to institutions, as a way to get these international students using concourse, that part of what EAB has just purchased internationally, it could allow students who put their profiles on the system to be admitted by institutions who just see their profile and know that everything's properly vetted and can accept them directly. And that is a very different system. It's a very, I think it could be a game-changing system if it becomes more universally accepted. And maybe it only takes a few countries that it gets trialed in to see if it works, but that could be a game changer for us in terms of competing for those same students that might be looking at other destination countries. And if you have aid available or scholarships available that you can then also give, it's almost like spot admissions, and the British have been doing this in Australian universities have been doing this in India for years. But this is an opportunity for the U.S. to be able to do this without even seeing who the student is, what they look like, anything else about them. You're going to be able to admit them through this kind of flipped admission system. It obviously throws everything on its head in terms of how we admit students now. But if you know the content that you're seeing has been properly vetted, if you know that there's no issues in terms of fraud or that type of thing, and if you're comfortable making a decision, but you see students and you can say, I'm going to offer admission to that student. I'm going to offer that student $10,000 a year scholarship just by picking them out of the litter that you might see on a site or a profile page. That's a game changer. So if that happens, it's probably the one of these mergers that we're talking about today, or acquisitions we're talking about today, that I think has the most long-term potential impact as in terms of a major player on the admissions, enrollment, and consulting side, marketing perhaps to universities. Hey, go with this kind of flipped admissions process. So we'll see. But that's the one with the most significant potential and as to how it might impact international admissions. So we'll see where that goes. The other two, one is Times Higher Ed, who has been in acquisition mode. They've been purchasing a number of different platforms recently, or companies recently in the last couple of years. Times Higher Ed has been in the ranking business for a while. I think they've bought Study International, and they've just bought Inside Higher Ed. They've now just bought BMI. BMI has been one of those event providers, both online and in person, for that have attracted international students to consider schools in most of the major destination markets. BMI's run these programs successfully in Latin America, Middle East. They're now part of the Times Higher Ed family of companies of international educators. So I don't know that necessarily is a game changer. That's not one that BMI fairs have been decent in the past that I've attended. Some people work with them exclusively. Others say it's a hit or miss, and the reality is probably somewhere in between. But I think my opinions of Times Higher Ed as a company, in the way they handled Russia and in related to the rankings, I don't agree with the way they've approached that. I don't like that they bought Inside Higher Ed, because if they put that behind a paywall, then that will rule out both of the major, other than the Pi News, which is my preferred international higher ed education story, news story source. If Inside Higher Ed goes away behind a paywall, then it's going to limit their appeal, frankly, in the United States. And certainly that there's a lot of concerns I have with Times Higher Ed, but not my favorite in terms of their approach to business. But we'll see where that goes. The third is not a niche one, but it's certainly it's actually a major player internationally in terms of the agent scene, and that's IDP's purchase of Intake Education. Intake has major offices in West Africa and in Taiwan, which are countries that Taiwan in particular, IDP does not have a significant presence in. That in West Africa in particular, IDP has opened offices in Nigeria recently and is expanding in West Africa and all of Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. You see that as a significant upgrade for IDP. So it's making one of the biggest players out there bigger, and in areas that hadn't been previously successful. And so I think that can be, for those that are working with IDP as part of their overall international education recruitment strategies, that will be a plus. How long it takes, they had webinars this past week for U.S. reps who are already IDP partners to see what that might look like for them. So we'll see how that shapes out, but that's a potentially big one as well. Last question of the day, and is one that is probably the most, outside of career services, probably one of the most underdeveloped areas of the international student journey on most college campuses. I say most, not all. There are a few shining lights out there that have well-defined international alumni programs, that have well-defined services within career services for international students, data even for international students to show where they can get jobs. What I think is important is, with this concept here, the question is, will international alumni networks become the norm for U.S. universities? I think they should. Will they? Probably not, because of the amount of work that's going to be involved in even getting institutions to care about their international alumni. No institution is going to say, no, we don't care who they are. But the practices on the ground in terms of the reality of, when I ask the simple question at a lot of institutions that I've consulted with, do you track your international alumni? Do you know where they are in the world? That's not just your international students who go home, whether they stay in the United States, your domestic alumni, if they move overseas, do you track that? They'd probably do the latter more than they do the former, but the reality is internationally based alumni of most institutions, unless they self-select in, they don't really get it. They don't really become a part of that network of graduates. But it's so important. When you look at what we've talked about in the past about how important outcomes are to prospective students, particularly at the undergraduate level, but also at the graduate level, how important job placement is, where they get into graduate programs, all of those things should be data points that you can speak to, ideally, to prospective audiences. Because they're asking about it. What's my son or daughter going to get after I drop $200,000 to $500,000 on their education over the next 4 years? If you can't answer that question effectively, about 80% of our students get jobs within 6 months of graduation. Yeah, that's all students. How about international students? who have very specific limits on them. They have to get a job within 3 months of graduation, otherwise be on approved OPT. They can only be in the country if they don't have a job for 2 months after they graduate. So what is that, unless they move to another status or get approved for OPT? So that, or start a new degree. So those are things that you have to ask yourself. Okay, do you have the data to support the answers that prospective students and parents are going to be expecting from you about where does my son or daughter have a chance of getting a job? Where can they intern? And what support do they get once they do graduate in terms of finding a job? There are services out there now that help students find positions in their home countries or in other countries around the world that most career services offices aren't prepared for. There may be there may be alumni networks that exist, and perhaps they can get plugged in, particularly if they're looking to stay in the United States. But that's a process that needs to start months before they graduate because of the restrictions that they have on them by immigration law. They have to apply within 60 days or 30 days of their graduation. They have to apply for OPT, and if that can start no later than 60 days. I think I may get my minimum days mixed up, but they're on a tight schedule once they're graduating in terms of working. So they have to back that up a bit, 6-8 months before they plan to start work. They need to be in touch with alumni that might be able to help them find jobs if they're domestic based and planning to stay in the United States. But if they are planning to go abroad, are there international alumni networks at your institution that can help identify potential employers in the country that they're looking to get to? So the reason this is coming up, there was an article from our friends at intl. It's the first of a two-part series, Prospective Students Seek a Career Network. And the second part of that series just came out today, and we'll profile that in the newsletter next week. But this first week really talks about the kind of things that you need to know related to, for undergraduates especially, about developing that network before they graduate, so that they can move seamlessly into the transition to the work world when they're finished with their degree. So they have some great resources in there for students that are looking to make that switch. And there's Dr. Gretchen Dobson's 2017 research on global alumni management for U.S. institutions, the state of the field. 65% at that point surveyed reported having no dedicated staff to international alumni management. 51% reported having insufficient time. 28% reported having an insufficient budget to meet their needs. So I think that there's certainly the need is out there, and maybe even within alumni offices, they say that 50%, more than 50% say that they found international alumni management very important to increasing recruitment and brand awareness, but 30% say didn't feel they received sufficient internal leadership support to make it happen. And this goes back to what we say all along when we're talking about internationalization on campus and what that looks like and what it needs to look like to be successful. And that's when you have top-down buy-in in terms of funding, not just words, funding for the necessary staffing that you need to bring in the students, the staffing especially to take care of them once they're on campus, but staffing to handle those back-end needs in career services and alumni, because those two are very much connected, and those will determine the end success of that student in terms of being able to find that job, be able to plug into an international network wherever they're going to be, that they know that their institution helped them get there. Yes, the student will be great and academically will be well prepared, hopefully, by the time they get through, but are they going to have the resources available to help them get to that next step where the ties will be cut from the safety and convenience of the university campus to what they're going to face in the real world in terms of that job support and that network to help them identify the right jobs. So great article series again coming from intl, and we'll profile next week's part 2 in or this week's part 2 in the newsletter on Monday. So be sure to subscribe to the newsletter if you're not already on that list. And if you are listening to the audio-only podcast version of the Midweek Roundup, thank you. We've now had over 2,000 downloads in our episodes over the years, and I'm very grateful that you're a part of making us a part of your international edification each week. So thanks very much for everyone for joining us, and we look forward to chatting with you again soon. Cheers.